Welcome, hope you're doing well. My name is Nago Daniel, and this is the first episode of a series where we'll be talking about Daoism. And I'm very excited to make this series because I find Daoism to be a completely fascinating topic. So I'm very excited to share it with you, and I hope that you'll enjoy it and you'll learn something new about this topic and you'll find it interesting. And as a preview of what this series is going to be about, it's just so that you know what you're getting into. In this first part, we'll be talking about a little bit about history, and before we really get into the meat of all of this stuff and into the deep waters, we'll talk a little bit about conventions and conventional knowledge, unconventional knowledge, and all the things that we believe that are actually out there that are really just conventions. Very exciting stuff. In the second episode, we'll be talking about the Tao, which this book is all about, the Tao Te Ching, the basic book of Taoism. That's also a very exciting video. I already got the script for it. And in the third episode, we'll be talking about, that will be the third episode, about the second principle of Taoism, which is the idea of mutual arising. Basically, it can be summed up in you can't have one without the other, you can't have something without nothing. That's basically the idea. In the third episode, we'll be talking about the idea of Wu Wei. It's very important to Taoism. This idea of non-action or not forcing, going with the Tao, going with the flow of things. So it's going to, I might add some other episodes. These are the ones that I have thought of so far. So it's going to be very exciting and very excited to share it with you. So let's get right into it. You see, in ancient China, there were two predominant philosophies, and this was Confucianism and Daoism. And these two philosophies complement each other, and they play in a remarkable way. Now, as you probably know, Confucianism is founded by this guy named Confucius. And generally speaking, Confucianism is all about conventions. It's all about social order. And it's involved in linguistic, ethical, and legal conventions. In other words, it's concerned with conventional knowledge. And here, children are educated so that their original and disobedient nature is made to fit the social order. Basically, it's all about how a man should be in society, how a society should work. And it's also concerned with roles. It talks a lot about the role of, the proper role of a father or a brother or a sister and all of that. And we'll talk more about roles when we get into conventions. Very interesting stuff. Now, what about Taoism? Well, as I said, it's a philosophy, but another way of putting it is that it's a way of liberation. And its founder is this guy named Lao Tzu, and he lived around 400 BC and wrote this book, the Tao Te Ching, which is the basis of this philosophy. And it's generally an occupation for older people, although I find it very interesting. And it's especially for men retiring from an active public life. And their retirement from society is kind of like an outward symbol of their inner liberation from conventional thoughts, from conventional thinking and conduct. And Taoism deals with unconventional knowledge, a direct understanding of life instead of understanding it in the linear and abstract terms of thinking. And we'll talk about later, I'll clarify all this on conventional and conventional knowledge. What's all this about? We'll talk later about that. So then, Confucianism is occupied with the socially necessary mission of forcing the natural spontaneity of life into the rigid rules of convention. And this, of course, involves conflict, and it results in the loss of this original and unabashed character of small children that they are loved for so much. You know how a children just goes up to another child and says to him, what a weird nose that you have. And Taoism, the function of Taoism, is to not only undo this harm done by Confucianism, but also to develop this original spontaneity of man, also called in Chinese Zhuran, or however you spell it, Zhuran, which means by itself, just as it is. And you could also say that another function of Taoism is to not interfere, to trust the flow of things and not get in our own way. Now you're probably interested more about Taoism, what's up with this Tao? It's all over Taoism, what's up with that? What's this Wu Wei? What's all of that about? And we'll talk about that later. But I think that first it's important to clarify what this conventional things are, what's all of this conventional knowledge, unconventional knowledge, and talk about some of the things that we believe that are really out there, but in fact are just conventions. Now, Alan Watts, in his book The Way of Zen, I have it in Romanian, in The Way of Zen he says that a big reason why Zen and Taoism cause confusion and we look at it as this mysterious thing is firstly because the completely different way in which the Chinese think compared to our way of thinking, and also because we have limited our perception of what human knowledge is. Because you see, most of our knowledge falls into what a Taoist would call conventional domain. Because you see, we feel that we understand something only if we can put it into words, or we can put it into any other kind of conventional system of science. It could be mathematical symbols, numbers, musical notations. I mean, you see, you only understand something if you can explain it to me, put it into words. Do you have an equation for that? Or if you can express it through music. You see, the interesting thing is that when I ask you, how do you beat your heart? How do you make a decision? How do you grow your brain? You can't explain that to me, but yet you do know how to do it. You know it because you do it. To quote Alan Watts from his book, he says, "Such a body of knowledge is called conventional because it is the result of a social understanding regarding communication codes. Just as people speaking the same language have a tacit understanding, such as the words should symbolize different things, so the members of each society and culture are united by communication ties based on all kinds of understanding, such as classification and evaluation of activities and things. Thus, the task of education is to make children capable of living in society, convincing them to learn and accept its codes, the rules and conventions of communication through which society maintains its cohesion." So you see, these conventions are tricky because a lot of the things that we believe that are really out there are just only conventions. I mean, of course, you know that you can't tie up a present with the equator because that's just an imaginary line. But just in the same way, other sorts of measurements like meters, kilograms, clock time, they are all just imaginary. But you see, they are so useful to us, and we just can't live in a society without them, that we mistake them for reality, and we start to believe in them. We believe that they're actually real, and this can lead to enormous confusion. It's like eating the menu instead of the dinner. You see, mistaking who you are with the roles that you're playing. We'll talk about this later. One of these conventions that I would like to mention and talk about is that of language. Now, of course, you probably know that we all agree that the word cloud points to that thing, the actual thing itself. But the word is not the actual thing itself. But you see, it's so useful. We can't communicate without it. We use it every single day. It's so useful that we start to mistake the word of language, how language represents reality, with reality itself. We start mistaking the symbolic reality, the conceptual reality with reality itself. And if you're interested, there's a YouTube channel that just posted one of these seminars of Alan Watts where he talks about confusing reality with the symbolic reality, with symbols and concepts. If you're interested, I'll leave a link to it in the description. Very interesting. So you see, the child, when he goes to school, he is taught to accept the word tree instead of the word that he came up with, boo-boo. He started to accept tree instead of boo-boo, which points to the same thing. And now, of course, it's easy to see that the word tree is just a social convention. And we all agreed that that word points to that thing, that object. But you see, there's also a not so obvious and very interesting side to this convention, that language limits the object that the word is pointing to. Let me explain. You see, the child is not only taught in school which words point to what, which words represent what, but also how his culture implicitly and tacitly agreed to separate things from one another and to highlight the boundaries between things in our everyday life. And you see, because of this, a scientific convention decides whether or not this shape is called a fish or a snake. And a grammatical convention decides what are objects and what are events or actions. You see, this can lead to a lot of confusion. And just to show you how arbitrarily we divide these things, let me ask you this question. What happens to my fist when I open my hand? What happened? Where did it go? You see, it just magically disappeared. Because in that sentence, what happens to my fist when I open my hand? The fist is an object. We mistook a noun for what is actually an action. It's a doing. This fist is not a thing. It's not a noun. It's a doing. I close my hand. Grammatically, it's a thing, it's a noun, it's an object. But in actuality, it's a process. Just to show you how arbitrarily we divide things and separate things. Tell me, where does my neck end and my head begin? You see, it is here, here, or it is here, or here. Where is it? Where is that line? I mean, of course, we only get that line where we cut our head off and, we have a clear separating line. But otherwise, we separate things very arbitrarily. Now you see, in the English language, the distinction between things, nouns, and events and actions are very clear. But in the Chinese language, a lot of the words can be seen both as a noun and a verb. So for them, you see, it's a lot easier to see that the world is really not a collection of things, but really a collection of happenings, that everything is a happening. This book is a happening, this laptop is a happening, I am a happening. See, it's like a whirlpool. Everything is like a whirlpool. See, one day you go out and you see a whirlpool in a lake. And then the next day you go out and you see the same whirlpool there doing its thing. And you say, wow, the same whirlpool is still there. That's the whirlpool, it's still there. But of course it's not still there. Because that whirlpool is changing. The water going through it is always changing. It's never the same. It's only the pattern. It's only the behavior. It's only the action that remains the same. But everything else is in a constant change. And this is true for everything. So I had to stop the recording, but now I'm back, so let's continue where we left off. We talked about the convention of language. And now the next convention, or social convention, whatever you want to call it, that I would like to talk about, is that of roles. You see, it would be pretty hard for us to communicate if we didn't know each other's roles. I mean, for example, when meeting a stranger at a party, it's always somewhat awkward when the host or the guy that's introducing you to the other person doesn't also give you his role. Because then you don't know what kind of rules of communication or rules of behavior you should follow with him. I mean, for example, if the host says, oh, come meet my friend Joe, he's a doctor, he's a teacher, he's an athlete, he's an artist, you probably would communicate differently based on the role that the guy has. And even if he just tells you, oh, come meet this guy, he's from the same town as you. Or come meet this guy, he went to the same school as you. It's not that awkward because you can identify each other. And you have some kind of common ground to start off. But see, when you don't know each other's roles, it's always somewhat awkward. You don't know how to act with each other. How should I talk with this person? I don't know who he is. It's like you don't have them under control. Because you see, someone without a role, we don't have them under control. He has no role. We don't have to have him pinned down. We don't know who he is. Someone without a role is dangerous. Now, of course, it's easy to see the conventional character of roles. Someone who's a father can also be a brother, a policeman, an artist, all sorts of roles someone can play. We're all role playing. And of course, you are not the sum of your roles, no matter how matching it is to your personality. You are not that. It's far from it. It doesn't contain anything, the sum of your roles, about how you circulate your blood. But you see, what's not so obvious and much more subtle is that from a young age we are taught to identify ourselves with an image of ourselves, with our ego, who we think we are, which has the same kind of conventional character as other roles. I mean, of course, you know that your ego is not a biological existence. It's only a convention, it's only some thought. See, just like with other conventions, it's very useful and we believe in it. We actually think that we are separated off from everything else and we're this center of action and center of attention that is completely separate from everything else and contained in this bag of skin. But you see, of course, who you think you are is not you. Your image of yourself, your personality is not you, just in the same way as an image of yourself, a photograph of yourself is not you. This image of ourselves is just a caricature. How do you spell it? Or caricature, I don't know how you spell that. But it's just that, because it doesn't tell me anything about how you grow your brain, how you pump your blood, how you grow your bones. It doesn't tell me anything about that. Yet you do those things. So you see, this ego, this conventional I, is only made up of memories, stalactites from the past. That's what keeping it alive. The illusion that what happened before, that's still me. Because according to this convention, I am not simply what I'm just doing right now, but I'm also all the things that I've done in the past. And this version of me, this past version of me, it almost seems like a more real version of me than what is actually right now, than who I am right now. Because you see, who I am right now, what I am right now is so fleeting, it's so intangible, it's always changing. But who I was, my past, it's fixed, it's definite, it's something that we can cling on to. So by this, it almost seems more real. I mean, just when I ask you the question, who are you right now? Show me who you are right now. Not referring to your past, your name, to what you did, where you grew up, what you do for a living. All of that's the past. I don't care about that. Who you are right now, that's what I'm interested in. See, this is not an easy question to answer. And you see, you can also make predictions of who you will be in the future based on who you were before. So then you see, we would rather identify ourselves with something that doesn't exist than with what is right now, with who you are now. I mean, isn't that interesting? And to quote you a quote from this book, from The Way of Zen by Alan Watts, he said, "It is important to recognize that the past memories and events that make up the historical identity of man are only a selection. From the real infinity of events and experiences, some were detached distinctly as significant, and this significance was, of course, determined according to conventional standards." Now, this translation might not be perfect because I got it in Romanian and I just ran it through DeepL, so... But now let's get back to the thing that I was talking about, conventional knowledge. You see, all conventional knowledge is based on a system of abstractions. And in these systems, the symbols are reduced to their most simple and generalized form. I mean, for example, you can look at the Chinese character for man. I mean, look at how it looks. It's the simplest form that you can get to the man. How a man looks, you know, this kind of like a stick man, the lower half of a stick man. To better explain, for example, also words like man, or flower, or growing, or running. See, all of these things are just classes of objects that have in common a very simple attribute from the whole complexity of the thing that they're actually describing. I mean, for example, take running for example. You could say that this is running or this is running, but you see, it's like we filter it through. We filter through the complexity of all of it so that we can like take it in by like a small spoon and we can talk about it and express it in language. But you see, if we actually wanted to describe running or walking or something like that, then of course we would have to describe all of the organism, the whole organism that's doing the walking. But you see, only even if we describe the whole organism that was doing the walking, then we would just have, a man just swinging his leg in empty air. I mean, that's not running. We would also have to describe the environment that he is in. And because everything depends on everything else, you would end up describing the whole universe. So this is really what's the point here, that these abstractions take out of all the complexity of the event, of the experience. They filter it and only leave in the like very simple and general things, the very basic stuff. Now, of course, we need these abstractions to communicate. We couldn't do without them. Because as we said, they allow us to represent our experience as like an extraction made in the mind, filtered through the complexity to a very simple form. See, just as a side note here, when we talk about the complexity of the body or the experience, you see, the complexity, that attribute is not in the body, it's in us trying to put it in words, to put it into words. That's what's hard. You see, I mean, you just have to, it's just going on. It's not difficult or complex at all. But when trying to understand it in this linear, abstract terms of thinking and words, of course that's complex. Because at the same time, here, there are like almost an infinite lines running at the same time. But you see, when trying to put it into words, we have just one line. We can't put it into words. You see, this is what it means, that you can only think of one thing at a time. That you cannot drink the whole ocean in one sip. You have to take it, cup by cup. And you see, abstractions and conventions are just like these cups, that they reduce our experience to their very simplest form so that it can be understood immediately. I mean, a very good illustration of this is the very screen that you're watching this video on right now. I mean, just imagine, put yourself in the shoes of the scientists or the programmers, trying to take a picture of something or trying to get something on a screen. I mean, how could you get this wiggly thing on a screen? Well, you divide it into a bunch of little cubes. You create a matrix of it. You see, it goes line by line, it zaps through the whole screen and puts the pixels there. And when it refreshes, when I move my hand, it quickly changes all the little pixels. It seems real, but it misses that detail, that life that it has. And to quote Alan Watts, he said, "Thus, communication through conventional signs of this type offers us a distinct transmission, piece by piece, of a universe in which things intermingle and happen simultaneously, a universe whose concrete reality always escapes perfect description through such language. The perfect description of a small particle of dust by these means would take forever, since every point in its volume would have to be taken into account. And now, of course, life doesn't happen in this linear and fragmented way. I mean, just imagine if we had to think about every breath that we took, every pumping of the blood that we had, every impulse in our nerves. Imagine if we had to think about all of that. I mean, we would have dropped that in a second. You see, but we do them anyways. We do them without thinking. We do them without knowing how we're exactly doing them. But we know it because we do it. We grow our bones, we heal our wounds. And to illustrate this ability of our mind, our whole organism, there's a very great analogy that we can take from our sense of sight, or also from light. You see, we have two kinds of vision. We have central vision and peripheral vision. It's just like a spotlight and a floodlight. With the spotlight, you can focus on something, and floodlight shines up everything. The central vision, you see, it's used for precise things. You see, like reading something, going along word by word, reading something, like just like a spotlight would go along and follow a person or something like that. Our peripheral vision, you see, while it's not as bright, it's not as alert as our central vision, as the spotlight, it can observe a lot more things at the same time. It can perceive a lot more at once. See, we use it to see at night and also to subconsciously notice some of the things that are not in our direct line of sight. Let me give you an example of this. You might be driving in your car, you see, with one of your friends, and your attention is completely on what your friend is saying. Your attention is focused on the conversation, but at the same time, without consciously doing it, you are driving the car, looking at the stop signs, stopping, going past all the idiots on the road, and you're doing all of that, but you're not paying any attention, like conscious attention to it. It's like you're doing it, it's doing it by itself. I mean, you have probably experienced this if you drive, where you're just listening to music or you're talking to someone else, but at the same time you're doing this complex maneuvers and all of that, almost crashing into someone. Or you use this peripheral mind that we have every single day to function in your body. You don't think about beating your heart, but yet you still do it. So then we have this great analogy between central vision and conscious thought and attention, and between peripheral vision and this mysterious process that allows us to regulate the complexity of our bodies. And you see, this ties back to what we said about the complexity of our bodies, that it's not in our bodies but in trying to explain it. You see, it's like trying to find out what's in a completely dark room with just one beam of light, with just one, like a beam of photon, and try to find out what's in that room. I mean, that's just impossible. So as we said, the tendency nowadays is that we only understand something if we can put it into words or some kind of linear abstract science or something like that. And Alan Watts said in his book that because of this, we do not trust and do not fully use this peripheral vision of our minds. He also gives an example of the difference between how Westerners learn music and how Oriental people learn music. I mean, we learn it by narrowing down the whole range of rhythms and tones into a fixed system of notations and then, learning those notations. But the Oriental musician uses a more rudimentary notational system, but he uses that just to remember the melody of the song. He learns the music not by, reading the notes, what's written on the notes, but by listening to the teacher's performance and trying to copy the master's work or something like that. But you see, this doesn't mean that we don't use our peripheral vision, as we said. You see, we use it every single day. And all sorts of athletes or any kind of profession that you can think of, you can use this, I think, as far as I understand it, and take this with a grain of salt, you can use this peripheral vision of our mind. Every artist, every worker, every athlete uses some kind of special variation of this power. You see, from an academic and a philosophical standpoint, we don't really put a lot of emphasis on this kind of peripheral vision of our minds. As Alan Watts says in his book, we have only just begun to realize its possibilities, and it seldom occurs to us how important and useful it is for that knowledge of reality. He's talking about this peripheral knowledge, which we strive to obtain through the cumbersome judgments of theology and metaphysics, or through deductive logic. Now, I also wanted to include this part where in his book, Alan Watts said that we don't have any institution that corresponds with Taoism in the West. And he said that because our Judeo-Christian spiritual tradition identifies the absolute God with the moral and logical order of convention. And it goes on to explain this. Maybe I put it up if you want to read it. But what also he mentions after this is the idea of the absolute. And that there's something fishy about this idea. And I think that I wanted to mention this because in the next video we'll be talking about the Tao, which is kind of like this idea of the basic, whatever that there is, this absolute. There's something fishy about this absolute, of course. It's also just an abstraction. It's also abstract. It's also just a concept. It's also like that our idea of the spirit, as opposed with the material, has more to do with the abstract rather than with the concrete. And to read you a very interesting quote from this book, From the Way of Zen by Alan Watts, he said that, but in Daoism, well, he's talking here about the absolute, but in Daoism, as in other paths of liberation, the absolute must never be confused with the abstract. On the other hand, if we say that the Tao, as the ultimate reality, as it is called, is the concrete rather than the abstract, this may lead to further confusion. We are therefore used to associate the concrete with the material, the physiological, the biological, and the natural as different from the supernatural. But from the Taoist and Buddhist point of view, these are still terms for conventional and abstract domains anyway of knowledge. Now I might be wrong, but the way I see it is the reason why they think that it's still conventional knowledge, the supernatural, all of that, is because the basic whatever that there is cannot be categorized. It cannot be put in the box and say that this is supernatural. It's all natural. It cannot be, you cannot do that. It cannot be categorized. And we'll talk more about this in the next episode when talking about the Tao. So you see, any kind of box that we put it in, it is wrong. You see, the moment we open our mouths to talk about it, we are wrong. Really nothing can be said about it. I mean, this is how the Tao Te Ching starts out, that the Tao that can be described, or the Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. There's nothing that we can say about it. And we'll talk about this in the next episode, so I won't go into this right now. To explain a little bit more about this idea, this concept of the absolute, and when asking what's the reality of us, what's the reality of this table, you see, very interestingly, things like biology and physiology are types of knowledge that represent real life in abstract terms. Because you see, biology and things like these, they measure and classify the real world according to how they use it. I mean, for example, just as how a real estate guy or a guy that owns land represents his piece of land that he owns in square meters, and the contractor represents that piece of land in tons or in truckloads, or as a soil analyst represent that piece of land in chemical structures. There are a whole bunch of ways to represent that piece of land, and we can't really say that one's better than the other or one is more correct than the other. It's like saying, you see, what's more real, the skin of a rabbit or the meat of a rabbit? And so in the same way, the human organism, from the point of biology, is, it's made up of bones and muscles and all of that. From the point of science, it's just a bunch of atoms or waves or whatever they are up to right now. So then, to say that the concrete reality of our organism is purely physiological or something like that, is just like saying that this piece of land is 5 tons, or it's 1,000 square meters. Alan Watts in his book said that if we say that reality is natural, that's quite accurate. If we mean by the word natural, spontaneous. It says here, natura naturans. You see, natura uns, or nature in itself. But if we mean by nature, what it right here, natura naturata, whatever that means in Latin or whatever language, meaning when we say what's the nature of this thing, what's the nature of this object, well, that's not so accurate. That's basically it. And as a final quote from this book, thus, in order to begin to understand what Taoism is about, we must at least be prepared to admit the possibility of a worldview other than the conventional one, some knowledge other than that contained in our superficial consciousness, which can perceive reality only in the form of one abstraction at a time. There is no real difficulty in this as long as we already know how to move our hands, how to make a decision, or how to breathe. Although we can hardly explain it in words how we do it. We only know how to do it because we do it. Taoism is an extension of this kind of knowledge, an extension that gives us a very different view of ourselves from that to which we have been conventionally accustomed, and which frees the human mind from the oppressive identification with the abstract self. And we'll talk more about these interesting stuff in the following episodes. So, getting back to the beginning, in Confucianism, it's all about, keeping things order. And it has this certain kind of anxiety attached to it. Whereas Taoism is more about trusting nature and trusting in the course of things. So then this was the first episode that I'm doing on Daoism. Hope you liked it, hope you enjoyed it. I enjoy making them. And you can find the second episode in the description or in the playlist where we talk about the Tao, whatever the stuff is, the basic whatever that there is, the Tao, what's up with that. So I'll see you in the second episode if that's posted when you're seeing this video. Very exciting stuff. And if you're interested, I got most of my information from Alan Watts, from his books, from his podcasts. You can check him out if you want to. So thank you for being here, thank you for watching this video. See you at the second part. Have a great day and goodbye.